Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to another episode in the category creation series of B2B Growth. I am joined by John Ruggi, again, the co-host of this series, VP of Marketing at Sky-Fi. John, how you doing, man?
James, it's a great day. How are things with you?
It is a great day, man. I'm doing well. Pumped to dive into this topic today. We're going to be talking about a big one. We've got 8 talking points here that I'm excited to have you unpack, but it's all around naming your category. This is something that you guys at Sky-Fi kind of in the heat of right now. We came up with the name for our category a few months ago, and a lot of these points that you jotted down here played a huge part in how we came up with the name content-based networking. But I'm excited to dive into these. Is there anything you want to share before we start getting into the granular specifics on things that people need to keep in mind as they're naming their category?
I think the thing for me was, naming a category, it's hard, James. And when you get to the end, it's like, you have 2 or 3 words that describe what you do. So what?
Yeah.
It's actually, it's much more difficult than I and others I worked with on it imagined. So hopefully sharing some of these ideas today will help expedite the process for listeners out there.
Yeah, I agree. It is not something that is easy to do. You feel this enormous amount of pressure because you're like, oh my gosh, like this could literally be, this is something we're going to be using for the next decade plus. So you feel an enormous amount of pressure, but I think it can be crippling. And I know we've talked about this I'm sure will be a consistent theme, but the name is a big deal. I don't want to discount and say that the name is not a big deal, but it's your execution on that name that matters so much more. Similar to naming a company, you look at Google. What does Google mean? Google means what we think it means because of their brilliant execution of their product over the last several years now. So again, don't be crippled. This is a big task, but don't be crippled by it because your execution of what you do with that name after coming up with it is far more important, in my opinion, than the name itself. But I want to go ahead and dive into the first of these kind of 8 things. John, you talk about using plain language versus esoteric language. Can you elaborate on that for us?
So the thing there is, the category name is something that you want people to use in conversation. And so if you're using esoteric or contrived terms, that just makes that more difficult. So to the extent that you can use existing words, or even if it's just existing, prefixes or kind of modifiers to words, that's really going to help adopt that category in the minds of people you're working with. So I would start there, try to use plain language. You guys have definitely done that really well with content-based marketing. That's very easy to say and very easy to understand.
Yeah. So you mentioned there content-based marketing. It's actually content-based networking. And I don't want to cut that out. I want to talk about this. It's a mistake that a lot of people have made when I share the idea with them. And it's something that we went honestly back and forth on. Should we name something that is so close that can be mistaken for another category? Content marketing is very, it's been around for, I think, close to a decade, if not more. And our category name is very closely tied to that. But I believe that the more we advocate for it, the more we kind of create, again, going back to the execution of the category being more important than the name, the more we evangelize this topic of content-based networking, I think we're going to see that happen less and less, where people are mistaking it for content-based marketing. Do you have any thoughts around that?
So, I didn't mean to mispronounce the name of your category, but I'm actually kind of glad that I did, because you hit upon a really good point, and that's, the name isn't just the end of things; that's just the beginning. And so, until you've really solidified that name in people's minds, it doesn't really stick. So, you and I have talked about content-based networking multiple times, and I've read it, I've heard it, but my mental model is still on content marketing. And so, just in the context of a live podcast, I just went back to content-based marketing, because that's my subconscious was kind of like hardwired with that term. And so, I think we were talking about using plain language. That's a piece of it. I guess the kind of risk with that is it's very easy to substitute another term that you're already familiar with for a very similar term that you might be trying to use instead.
Yeah. So it's definitely something that we thought about, we considered as we were kind of, before we had announced the name. I noticed that people were kind of defaulting to saying marketing instead of networking. And it was still something that we decided to move forward with, because feel like that word networking, especially in some new, in a new market that we're going to be pursuing, like local professional services for these local shows that we're going to be producing, networking is a word that has very positive connotation in that particular market. And so there's a lot of thought that went into that, but I'm really glad that happened, because I think that that's a really good thing to talk through. Because if you're naming something that can be confused or closely related to another category, it's worth having a conversation and really figuring out what side of the coin you want to come out on. The second talking point we're going to cover, John, is you want to reference an existing idea. So I guess this is really good considering what we just talked about. But talk about this for us.
So when you name a category, you don't need to define that category to a really fine degree. The goal of the name is to get the idea pointed in the right direction. So when someone starts to think about you, they're at least not going away from where you want them to head. And so to do that, if you can use an idea or a word that people can already reference, but maybe it's a modification of that, that's a good way to kind of frame the conversation in the right way without getting things like overly specific right off the bat.
Got it. So are there any examples that you can think of that would be good to talk about here?
Big data is always a term that I've kind of liked. I know it's kind of a buzzword now, and it's maybe a little cliche, but it's such a perfect example of two really kind of mundane words. I mean, big, that's not very exciting. Data certainly isn't. Yeah. But when you put those together, big data, okay, well, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but it kind of sounds interesting, right? So if you could maybe have come up with a much more like complex way of saying that, but people know what big means, they know what data means, and so that gets them pointed in the right direction.
I love it. All right, this third piece is balancing between the broad and the specific. Talk to us about this one.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to an idea that you and I talked about in a previous episode. You don't want a term that can only apply to you. If it does, that's not really a category name. That's just a unique way of describing your company. At the same time, it can't be so broad, like you can't say you're a software company that's so broad as to almost mean nothing.
Yeah.
So you need to find this middle ground of being specific enough to kind of create a new idea in people's minds, but not so specific that it can't apply to other companies that might be competing against you.
Yeah, there's an art to that. I mean, it's easy for us to say that, but as we both have kind of gone through the process of naming categories, there really is an art to this. But that's a great point. This fourth thing that you mentioned is that the name needs to be available. Now, this may seem like common sense, but honestly, I think a lot of people can miss this. Talk to us about the need for the availability.
So it's a pretty practical consideration. And the reason I say that is if you're successful in creating this category, people will start searching for it. And if it's a term that's already used by someone in your space or maybe in an entirely different field, that can create some challenges because you or that like the appropriate results for that category may not come up right away. So to the extent you can find a term or a phrase that isn't really widely used yet, that's going to be a win.
Yeah, I love it. And not necessarily just finding a available domain, but really looking at the, Googling the term and seeing like, can we own this term in Google organically without having to necessarily, pay for ads. And I know whenever you and I have had conversations in the past, you brought that up, and I didn't even necessarily think about that, but it's definitely something that is going to make an impact long term. So this fifth point is understanding the connotation of the words that you use. Can you elaborate on that, John?
So I'll give you a couple of examples of words that we were considering that we moved away from because we couldn't really control the connotation there. So one of those words was holistic. And when we share later about the category we're actually going to use, you'll have more context. But we're using this idea about holistic and applying it to data. And holistic can work really well in a sentence when you have more context around it. But when you use that term on its own or just with another word, you get this idea maybe of like holistic healing, which is, and it's completely different space or other context. So another word was universal. And universal is such a broad word. It's used in, I know there's like religions that use universal or denominations. It's used in science. It's used like your car has a universal joint. So that was another one that was a little bit too broad for us to really get that ship pointed in the right direction. So just think through, the term might be appropriate, but think through how that term is going to be perceived, especially in people who are in other fields that you might work with. So if you're a marketer and you're working with people in IT or technology, that term might mean something completely different for them. So do that homework ahead of time to make sure you don't run into any surprises.
Yeah, makes sense. This next one, John, I think is really interesting, that you need to think through, how well will the terms that you use translate globally? Talk to us about this one.
This one's a little trickier. It may not apply to everyone unless you're really aspire to be a global business, which is great. And maybe if you're looking at a category, that's what you should do. But I think, James, you probably heard of this story. This is not a B2B example or even a category example, but do you remember Chevy had that car years ago? I think it was in the 80s, and it was called the Nova.
Oh, yeah.
So in Spanish, it means no go. And it seems like a no-brainer, like that they would have done that research, but obviously that car did not sell very well in Hispanic markets. so it's probably not something like that. They were kind of coining a new term or a new word, but I guess the point is like, you need to look at how that term would translate. Is there a direct translation for that, or is that going to be ambiguous in other languages? If it is, just maybe proceed with caution, or maybe look at some other ideas.
Got it. All right. The seventh note here is that the name needs to invoke conversation. How do you come up with a name that does that? Is it similar to what you were talking about earlier, big data, where it's like both of those words are so simple, but it invokes this kind of curiosity?
Yeah, I think this is my favorite one, James, because it's kind of fun. It's like if you say what your category is, or like, our company is XYZ, and someone says, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" That means you've nailed it, because it means you've got something that is like, you kind of painted a picture in their mind, but it's not so specific that it doesn't leave anything to the imagination. So if you can pique their curiosity when you put that out there, man, that's really powerful, because then they want to learn about it and they want to explore more. And so, it's hard to like construct that, I guess, but maybe this is something you could think of kind of towards the tail end of your exercise. If you throw that idea out to people as you're thinking through that term, and the response is something along the lines of like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Like, what is that?" Then you're on the right track. And I think has that been your experience with? I'm going to get it right this time. Content-based networking. How is that shaking out?
Yeah. So I think in the context of how I've brought it up and how I've been talking about it, I have noticed that when I mention it, it does invoke at least more questions. Now, obviously, I'm not around anytime other people are mentioning it. And so it's impossible for me to know, like, kind of outside of my own, sharing of it, how it's being talked about in the market. But yeah, time will tell if we have nailed that part of the equation. So we'll see. But this last one is super interesting to me, John. It's around phonetics, how the name actually sounds. How do you think about this?
So James, one of my favorite musicians is Bob Dylan. And
yes.
So you may know this, maybe you don't, but his original name was Robert Zimmerman. And that name's actually Yeah, you hadn't heard that. Okay. So, I mean, the name is easy to say, right? And it's probably not that hard to spell. But
Yeah.
who's going to really say that they're a huge Robert Zimmerman fan? I don't know. It's at least for a folk musician,
Yeah.
it doesn't really have the right ring to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about how he went down that road or why he chose Bob Dylan specifically. But the point is, people are going to assign certain emotions and thoughts around the way your name is pronounced, and if it's difficult to say, or if it sounds like overly nerdy or overly plain, or whatever kind of attributes are important or you want to stray away from, that's going to happen. And so this might be towards the bottom end in terms of priority. But if you've got a few ideas down and you can't really decide which one to go with, look at phonetics. People are going to say it out loud. They're going to read it, and that's going to affect the way that they perceive that category.
I love it. This has been fantastic, John. So just a very high level overview here. You want to use plain language instead of esoteric language. You want to reference an existing idea. You want to balance between the broad and the specific. Name needs to be available, not just the domain, but also look at the availability of your ability to rank for that term on Google organically. You want to understand the connotation of the words that you use. Can your category name be taken out of context? Can it mean something completely different than what you want it to mean? Globally, how well will the terms you use translate? You want your category name to invoke conversation. Then you need to be mindful of the phonetics, how the actual name sounds. This has been fantastic. I think it's super tangible and practical advice here, John. I think folks are going to get a ton of value out of this. Anything else you want to add before we shut it down today?
I guess I'll just say that if you are out there and you're thinking of a category name, I'd love to hear your thought process. And I'm always curious to hear what other categories exist that I'm not aware of. And so if there's something on your radar that maybe we should talk about, or you just want to share with James and I, let us know, because that's always interesting to hear about.
Awesome. How can folks get in touch with you, John, if they want to shoot you an email? What's the best way for them to do that?
Open up your browser and put in john.marketing. That'll get you to the right place.
Super easy. John.marketing. You'll see all of his contact information. And then I'm James Carberry on LinkedIn and Twitter, and james@sweetfishmedia.com. John, and this has been incredible. Looking forward to the next one.
You too, James. Thanks.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. You know, all those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency at no cost. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.